Good evening, colleagues. Dumelang molweni. Welcome to all of you to this inaugural lecture, and a very special welcome to our guest of honor, Professor Adam Haupt, and his family and friends. Professor Haupt's mom is here, sister, partner, and son, and many friends in the hall who are here to support or to celebrate with us on this wonderful achievement by Professor Haupt. Tonight, it's not just only about celebrating Professor Haupt, but it's also about thanking you and celebrating with you, the family, because no one gets to this level on their own. They get here with family who sacrifice their time to give them time to do that which they love, who supports them, who walks the journey with them, and here we are today, welcoming him to the professoriate, and it's thanks to you too, so we celebrate with you. It's my pleasure to introduce to you my colleagues on the platform party this evening. If you don't know who I am, my name is Mamu Kheti Pakeng. Don't worry, we're not going to ask you to spell it at the end of the ceremony. And on the podium here in the platform party, we have Professor Liz Lange on my extreme left. Then we have Professor Loretta Ferris. Professor Liz Lange is our DVC for Teaching and Learning. Professor Loretta Ferris is our DVC for Transformation. Then we have Dr. Quintin Williams of the Linguistics Department at the University of the Western Cape, who will give the vote of thanks after Professor Haupt has given the lecture. And we have Professor Haupt himself, who will be introduced by Associate Professor Kesi later. And of course, Associate Professor Shose Kesi, who's Acting Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. The topic of tonight's lecture is Remixing Scholarship, Hip-Hop, the Humanities and Knowledge Production. For many young people, hip-hop is their language. It began as a form of protest in the 1970s in the Bronx in New York for marginalized communities such as Latino and African American youth. Today, we have some South African hip-hop artists being brand ambassadors for mainstream brands such as Samsung, Nike, X-Deodorant, Reebok, and Turkish Airlines. This doesn't mean that their message has become mainstream, but rather that they are recognized for the voice they give to young South Africans. Just as it is important to hear their message, it is also important to have Black voices speaking into the academic arena about hip-hop, not just following the trend, but understanding its importance to our society, the discourses that arise in and through our music. And this is why it's important to have academics such as Professor Haupt, who will share his insights this evening on the relevance of humanities scholarship in achieving the country's developmental objectives and decolonizing knowledge. While the practice of giving inaugural lectures is an ancient one, it is also relevant for our own lives. And this is a platform where those who have achieved the highest academic rank possible can share with us their passion, and Professor Haupt will do that today. Even without a guitar, he will do it. The insights that he has gained and his vision for how life can be made better for others. Professor Haupt is a good example of how we, at the tip of the African continent, are creating and sharing with the rest of the world knowledge that is relevant to our daily lives. And I want to invite Professor Shose Kesi to introduce Adam formally.
Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, distinguished guests, the Haupt family, colleagues and friends. It's a great privilege to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Adam Haupt, to present his inaugural professorial lecture. Adam Haupt is Professor of Media Studies in the Center for Film and Media Studies at UCT. It must be noted from the very start that Professor Haupt is very well known at UCT. His long-standing relationship with this institution started almost 30 years ago. He completed his Bachelor of Arts degree at UCT in 1992, then returned to UCT in 1996 to pursue a master's and PhD, which he completed in 2006. Over time, Professor Haupt has gained a reputation for pushing boundaries both in his academic pursuits and as a member of the UCT community in general. As a young scholar, he became the first South African to publish scholarly work on hip-hop in the country. Later on, he pioneered changes in media and cultural studies in South Africa through his scholarship linking hip-hop studies to research on intellectual property, subversive technologies, and corporate globalization. Professor Haupt is an NRF-rated scholar and the author of many publications, including Static, Race and Representation in Post-Apartheid Music, Media and Film, published in 2012, and Stealing Empire, P2P, Intellectual Property and Hip-Hop Subversion, published in 2008, and is co-editor of Never Again, Hip-Hop Art, Activism and Education in Post-Apartheid South Africa, which was published this year with Quentin Williams, Emil Janssen, and Sami Alim. He also co-produced an EP, hashtag In the Key of B, for the book project with hip-hop artist Bradley Lodvig. Professor Haupt is co-editor of Journal of World Popular Music special double issue on hip-hop activism and representational politics with Quentin Williams and Sami Alim. He serves on the advisory board for the first hip-hop book series by University of California Press and on the advisory board of Cypher, Hip-Hop Interpolation, which is funded by the European Research Council. Professor Haupt is coordinating editor of the new Journal of Global Hip-Hop Studies with Griffiths Rolfson. His most recent international publication on race, academic freedom, and debates about decolonization is called Liquid Racism, Possessive Investments in Whiteness and Academic Freedom at a Post-Apartheid University, published in The Intersections of Whiteness, edited by Evangelina Kindinger and Mark Schmidt. Prof. Haupt was the recipient of the prestigious Harvard Mandela Fellowship in 2010 and spent some time at the Du Bois Institute for African and African American Studies, now the Hutchins Center at Harvard University. He has delivered a number of keynote lectures and presentations throughout the world about music, copyright, race, gender, media freedom, and the transformation of universities, and has a strong media presence on issues of race and culture. Prof. Haupt is also an avid guitarist and spoken word artist and has performed at a number of events, most recently in Cape Town and Berlin. It appears that for Adam, the music and the performance are more of a passion or a calling rather than a professional endeavor. He uses his performance as a political statement, highlighting the political questions of our time, thus bridging academia, real life, and activism in the pursuit of social change. These performances are also often family events, where father and son can be seen walking the stage together. I am assuming, Razin, that your father has schooled you in intellectual property rights and royalties. I understand also that Razin reads music, whereas Adam plays by ear, which leads to some interesting conversations between the two of you. Since I am on the topic of family, I also want to add that we are deeply indebted to you, Soraya, for sharing Adam's time with us over these many years. Indeed, Professor Haupt, many of us have witnessed your scholarly, artistic, activist work and are grateful not only for these contributions, but also for the fact that you do all of this work whilst remaining a dedicated member of the UCT community, always ready to support your colleagues and participate in transformative events at UCT. This can be seen through your unwavering support and active participation in the work of the BAC since its inception, as well as your different roles as chair of the Transformation Committee in the Humanities faculty, your stint as head of department of CFMS, and now in the role of Deputy Dean for Staffing in the Humanities faculty. I am personally extremely grateful to you for your insights, your commitment, and your support to me and to the Deanery in recent times. I have no doubt that these investments in the institution emanate from your own experiences as a Black scholar in academia. Colleagues and friends, Professor Haupt is the first UCT-produced Black full professor in film and media at UCT. Before coming here today, I asked some of your colleagues what they would want me to say about you that has struck them in particular. The responses were a vocal member of the academic community, and that everyone should know him for his fiery inputs at Senate, a devoted father, his guitar playing, and his musical duets with his son. Professor Bosch says that whenever your colleagues travel internationally and say they work at CFMS, people say, "Oh, with Adam." The head of department of CFMS, Professor Wasserman, described you as a respected member of the Center for Film and Media Studies, where you make a valuable contribution to the department's teaching and research in cultural and media studies, and that you are known to your colleagues as someone who is as comfortable discussing cultural theory as the political headlines of the day, and the instigator of many engaging debates and disputes around the coffee machine in the staff room. Professor Haupt, these contributions speak to how people see you as a human being, a family man, a scholar, and as someone who has opened up spaces for many of us over time to find voice and expression in order to renew the hard work of building an institution that we all dream of. An institution where race, class, gender, and other markers of difference are recognized and celebrated, not only as individual choices and characteristics, but as identities that carry with them experiences and histories that contribute to knowledge creation and innovation. An institution where contemporary questions of politics, music, art, social justice, and access to material resources are at the center of the academic project. It is scholars like you who will keep the academic project relevant and alive in South Africa. Colleagues and friends, please join me in welcoming Professor Adam Haupt.
Thanks, Shorsi and Haiti. Thanks for that introduction. A couple of surprises in that presentation. To begin with, I'd like to thank my family. It hasn't been easy. A rough road in many respects, but really the togetherness, the honesty, sometimes the brutal honesty, was a necessary part of the journey. And I think the VC is right, you don't do this on your own. This isn't a singular effort. It takes a community to build individuals who push ahead and so on and so on. Those individuals are a part of something bigger. And I think that needs to be acknowledged, especially from a gender perspective, because oftentimes achievements are gendered male and are seen as singular outside of a context. And we know that that is not the case, which is ironic because that kind of speaks to some of what I want to speak to in this presentation. I would also like to, before I go into the detail of my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge my own colleagues in media studies, but also colleagues from other disciplines in other faculties. I've actually spent a lot of time outside of my department, outside of my faculty, learning so much from so many of you. Many of you are not even present. And I think the sort of the will, the resolve to push against disciplinary boundaries and to reach out against geographical, disciplinary, political racial division, racial and gender divisions, boundaries. That is important. That's where the real action is. So some of my most meaningful contributions, excuse me, a tad nervous, so my mouth is dry. Better. Some of my most meaningful turning points from a career perspective have been from people outside of my discipline. So, for example, I met Edgar Peterson and Dimitri Erasmus on a significant book project, which led to another book project with Edgar Peterson. Neither of them are from literature or media studies, right? And that sort of set the tone for my relationship with scholars, that was always about pushing beyond the boundaries of a particular discipline. And that's how I came to leave English Lit and find myself in media/cultural studies. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. I need to acknowledge the generosity of older scholars who were willing to invest time in mentoring me and creating opportunities for me and egging me on. So thanks on that note. But, so let's talk about my actual presentation. It's called Remixing Scholarship, Hip-Hop, the Humanities, and Knowledge Production. In many respects, it was really just an excuse for me to make my interest in hip-hop speak to my interest in intellectual property, and located in broader discussions about knowledge production, and what counts as knowledge, and how that knowledge is shared. And so, what I'm about to present to you, if you've read my work, shouldn't be brand new. It's a remix. It's got a slightly different beat, but there are recognizable elements. So I'm sampling a lot of what I've already produced, right? So if you know me, you'll recognize arguments coming from Stealing Empire, and then you'll recognize elements coming out of a book called Static, but then also collaborative efforts. A lot of this work it wasn't a thumbsuck. It was a product of me joining, forces with people outside of my disciplines. Some of the most significant recent collaborations have been with sociolinguists. I got to work with Quentin Williams and H. Sami Alem on a double issue on hip-hop, JWPM, but then also my work with Sami on a book with a set of educators from the States who were looking to rethink pedagogy. That made such a big difference in my sense of what I can do with my scholarship. And so that needs to be acknowledged. So some of those arguments, some of those elements are recognizable in this project. I should also point out that the book, I will be speaking to the book somewhat. A lot of the work, this chapter, this paper that I'm presenting to you is actually chapter 30 of that book, Never Again, which is on sale outside if you want a copy. And I will sign it to you free of charge if you buy it today, but today only, while stocks last. The book is exciting for me because it does a number of things. It attempts to decenter scholarship. Decenter scholarship in this sense, it brings together writing by an interesting assortment of scholars working on hip-hop, but some of them blur the line between creator / artist and scholar. So one artist is Diff, Adrian. Poet, scholar, filmmaker, and when you read his chapter, that paper is all of those things. It's quite a creative piece of work. Marlon Swai does the same thing. Marlon is very much the anthropologist, the scholar, but actually is also an amazing poet, right, and performer. And so that features in his writing. Took it a step further. Okay, so we've got scholars / artists / activists, but what about the artists and activists themselves? What about the people we actually talk about? What if we included them in the book and decentered the voices of the scholars? And that's what happened. We had contributions from artists and activists in the form of op-eds, opinion pieces, right? So the essays, along with edited transcriptions of interviews, panel discussions, public debates around a particular set of issues. And so you have this polyphonic piece of work. You also have poetry, sometimes featuring in the actual essay by the author, and that is amazing, right? You've got visual art coming through, particularly by Ferenc Isaacs, who couldn't be here, unfortunately. His sister's taken ill. Ferenc's work took this project to another level. The project before Ferenc's contribution was like those old 1970s black and white TVs, those big tube TVs. And Ferenc is like the full what do you call those things? Those lead crystal TVs, those amazing pieces of work. So it really brought you in. It brought the characters to life. And so the work took a step beyond that, beyond the photographs. We actually worked in this project. I think I'm on time. I'm not sure why. I shouldn't be timing myself. We worked in this project. If you buy the book or if you go to the book's website, you will be able to listen to a stream of an album we recorded. Bradley Lodewyk, who I think came in, and Bradley Lodewyk co-produced with me. He's the big brain. He's the guy who knows a guy. And so whenever we needed something on a project, he would know a bass guitarist, he would know a saxophonist, and these are amazing, unassuming people from the Cape Flats. Think about all of the racist and sexist stereotypes of the Cape Flats, and think about how that might get turned on its head when you're in a one-room studio on the Cape Flats, and someone just lets rip on saxophone, and you go, oh my, wow, right? So you didn't see this coming. So a lot of artists, instrumentalists, and MCs feature on this project. Some of those artists have performed with us. One recent project is a performance at HKW in Berlin. Eavesdrop managed to join us, and so we spoke about the book as well as perform material from this project. Locally, we've performed this material, a Heritage Day performance at Artscape, for example. Very, very interesting community arts project with the Cape Cultural Collective. So an interesting journey with them. And so that is the book. The book captures some of that. So this isn't a boring scholarly piece of work that theorizes hip-hop, et cetera. It's polyphonic, it's multimodal. But if you want to find out how that works, check out the book and download the music. For now, basically, this presentation really speaks to these issues. I'm not going to speak to all of them, but this presentation speaks to these questions. What is the relevance of the humanities right now? In a situation where the humanities are underfunded and there are all sorts of criticisms, attacks on humanities scholarship, we have people speaking about the dangers of identity politics in a context where racialized and gendered privilege remain firmly entrenched on a structural and systemic level. So attempts to dismantle that gets met with criticism, right, of the humanities, of identity politics, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very, very, very messy context. And in that context, there are questions about humanities relevance. How will a thesis on Sir Gawain and the Greenites contribute to the country's development objectives? Questions like that. And that's an extreme example. How will another thesis on Shakespeare's sonnets, make the world a better place? That is the environment within which I work. And what I want to suggest is that humanities scholarship is being reworked by a number of scholars. There's the canon, for example, in literature, there's a literary canon, and even at the English department at UCT, you will find that English department is reworking that canon, is questioning it, is taking it apart, is deconstructing it, is decentering it. So even there, this work is being done. So it's being done in a number of places. Critical questions are being asked about epistemology, about the political economy of scholarly publishing, which is what I want to do in this presentation. I want to pose questions about political economy in relation to IPR. But then there's also critical work on multilingualism, on culturally sustaining pedagogies, and the broadest sort of context is this call for decolonization. There are more things. There's environmental humanities, there's the medical humanities people. There are all sorts of interesting things being, that are being done by scholars, innovative things that are incredibly necessary. I'm not going to speak to all of them, but that is the ballpark within which this project, my work, is situated. So let's talk about the actual presentation. Basically, this presentation is a remix. You can walk out right now, buy the book, and read this chapter. It's chapter 30, right? But don't go yet. Watch me drink this glass of water first. So, what is this paper about? So, Decolonizing Knowledge, that was the chapter title. And the question that I answer in the paper is basically, the question is, what can a brief consideration of hip-hop sampling tell us about the commercial hip-hop of countercultures and about cultural appropriation? That's the one question. And then the most interesting part is, can we see a parallel with the issues in music and hip hop and scholarly publishing? Because when I talk to my students about the music stuff, the sampling, piracy on the internet, the stuff about cultural appropriation, they are really, really interested. When I talk about scholarly publishing, they fall asleep. And so my mission was to sort of argue that actually they're part of the same problem. The issues in music and technology are actually the same issues in scholarly publishing. And in actual fact, the scholars who supposedly live in an ivory tower and operate in this little bubble, and scholars who believe that they are far removed from the messiness of media industries, of corporate media industries, are actually delusional. They're the same problem. Right? The problem that you see in the music industry is the same problem that you see in scholarly publishing. And I'll tell you how if you stay tuned. So the broader context is the commodification of knowledge in what is being called the fourth industrial revolution. But that fourth industrial revolution is actually a corporate revolution in many respects. It's this commodified thing. So the digital terrain is being increasingly commodified, right? And there's this assumption that if you want innovation, you need corporate interest in a field in order to seed it. But if you do the research in digital media, especially with the development of P2P platforms, with the development of social media platforms, what used to be called Web 2.0, right? Back in 2008. All of those platforms, all of those tools were actually not developed by the big tech companies, the big corporates. It was, the world of the hacker, the open source hacker, the developer, the logic of open access that gave us a lot of the protocols upon which other platforms sit. So in other words, the logic of the commons gave us this fourth industrial revolution. So that's the backdrop. That's another paper, but I just thought I'd flag that as an issue. We could argue and agree to disagree, maybe over drinks afterwards, or a milk tartlet. I think I saw one. So I argue that the commodification of knowledge goes beyond the context of just music and media production. We should be reading this in relation to the bigger context of neoliberal economics, right? And the ways in which neoliberal economics shape scholarly publishing, shape our conceptions of excellence in the scholarly context. And of course, that a university like UCT is big on branding itself in a particular way. And so excellence and citation indices and publication in journals with high impact factors, that's the game that we're playing. I'll argue that that is a neoliberal game. And so in many respects, that game is not so different to the music game, right? Or the attention economy with Web 2.0. But before I can do that, and I'm 15 minutes in, I can't believe it, I quickly just have to explain sampling to you. Apologies, I'll stop fiddling with this. Digital sampling, when I started doing research on hip hop, it was for a master's degree at the University of the Western Cape, the first South African to do postgrad research on hip hop, right? On South African hip hop. And a big part of what I was looking at was sampling. I needed to make sense of sampling. What is sampling? Any mainstream sort of industry player will say to you, sampling is a problem, it's copyright violation, it's piracy. But just very basically, what is it? You're just grabbing snatches of audio from any media using whatever tools. Back in the day, you'd be using hardware to grab small snatches of sound in order to recontextualize them, rework them, and produce new media. That's all that it is, right? It actually does precede hip-hop. So it was a part of cassette culture. By the time turntablists realized that you could use vinyl in a particular way in order to sample and reproduce and produce live sounds and record them, et cetera, et cetera. By the time that was happening, you had particular kinds of hardware that helped you to do that. But there was an analog precursor to sampling before MIDI technology was fully developed. So I'm acknowledging that. But the story of sampling in hip-hop is a very particular political story. And whereas producers of genres prior to hip-hop might have actually masked the means of production, right? You have a trumpet here, a drum beat there, then mask it. What hip-hop heads did was, when they produced, they drew attention to the fact that this was cobbled together in a particular way. And it became this game. Can you guess where this came from? I bet you can't. I bet you can't. Right? So it pushed you to develop your literacy, pushed you to sort of figure out where the stuff comes from. So there's something postmodern about this game. Some people would say rock and mainstream pop actually worked with the myth of the auteur, the singular auteur producing the sound. What hip-hop artists, hip-hop samplers and engineers did was to remind you that there's a whole backstory to, say, for example, the trademark sound of Carlos Santana. It's the Marshall amplifiers, the PRS guitar. It's a particular kind of set of preamps, right, and overdrive pedals. It is also the way in which the sound engineers mic up the hardware and run it through a particular set of pieces of software to produce a particular trademark sound. So there's an entire crew of people working on a particular sound that you associate with Carlos Santana. And it's not, excuse me, it's no accident that it's called a trademark sound, because trademark is one of the 3 forms of intellectual property. So you associate the identity of the male genius lead guitarist with a particular sound, and it is commodifiable. It becomes something you can trademark, right? It becomes intellectual property, it becomes commodifiable. So with that as a given, and I'm flying through this, Tricia Rose wrote a book called Black Noise in '94. And my mother had just come back from Chicago via London, hanging out with his sister, and got me this book called Black Noise by Tricia Rose. And I'm like, wait a minute. Does she know about our black noise from the Cape Flats? Is this an accident? And also, she was doing a set of things, a particular set of readings of hip-hop, that I thought, hey, I thought I'd be the first to make these connections, I thought arrogantly. This scholar wrote an entire book on these issues, right? Tricia Rose was instrumental in my understanding of the politics of hip-hop and the backstory behind cultural appropriation in the music industry. And what she says is, because black musicians, African-American musicians in her context, were marginalized, were exploited in particular kinds of ways, and became victims of cultural appropriation, maybe sampling by a generation of hip-hop DJs and producers was payback. You Schneider, a set of soul artists and R&B artists, blues and rock artists out of revenue, they don't have the rights to the music they produced. They're sitting in your back catalog. These artists are going into second-hand record stores, second-hand stores, going into basements, digging through crates, literally. It's called digging the crates. Like anthropologists looking for lost artists, people who have been forgotten, looking for new sounds, right, in order to produce this work. And in a sense, what they ended up doing was to challenge listeners to figure out where this stuff came from. So they became historiographers, black historiographers. If mainstream media and mainstream scholars were not going to acknowledge the contribution of black artists to the cultural history of the US, then these samplers were going to do that work. So you would literally listen to something and reverse engineer it and try to figure out where the sample comes from and discover, oh, I never knew raw Ayers existed. Everybody Loves the Sunshine. Remember that song? Dr. Dre did this cool sample of Ayers. And I'm just using that as an example because that is true of me. I didn't know Roy Ayers existed. I'm like, I love this sample. Where does it come from? Roy Ayers, right? And so now you discover an artist who is actually still alive and most people don't know about. That's just one example. So it serves a political function. So it's payback. We're stealing this back. You stole this from a generations of black artists prior to the present. Now we're taking it back, right? And one artist who spoke to the politics of representation in mainstream media, one set of artists is Public Enemy. And I'm not going to read all of it. But let me read some of it again. Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant shit to me, you see. Straight up racist, that sucker was simple and plain. Motherfuck him and John Wayne, right? I love that line. I love it. Why Elvis? I had an argument with a scholar in Germany just last week about Elvis, right? Why Elvis? Elvis, the king of rock and roll. The first time I interviewed Reddy D, my first interview, actually it was Suraya. Suraya and I interviewed Profs of the City in 94. She shot it, and we were a two-person crew. When Elvis came up, this is a line from Reddy D. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. Bullshit, right? And that summed up what was wrong with the music industry. Here you have a white artist who was able to mainstream black cultural expression at the expense of black artists and take it to mainstream white-paying audiences, and do so at the expense of a particular set of people who never got to profit off of the work that they produced. And Elvis becomes a signifier of a proud American century like John Wayne. That proud American century is basically just, it's patriotism, sure, but actually, let's be more specific, it's ethno-nationalism, right? It's Benedict Anderson's critique of nationalism. Nationalism serves a particular kind of role, but it's dangerous when it becomes ethno-nationalism. And so that's what the States has been doing. It's particular representation using signifiers like Marilyn Monroe, John Wayne, Elvis Presley, et cetera, produced a reinforced cultural racism, essentially. And so sampling, lyrically sampling, this isn't actual audio sampling, but producing these intertextual references, produce the effect of, well, actually aim to challenge hegemonic representations of American history, American nationalism, right? In order to point to the racialized and gendered contradictions in that master narrative of what America is and what American pop culture is. And so that's where the battle is fought. But let's bring this home. This is critical perspective, even in '94, in that first interview that Suraya and I conducted, where Reddy D is speaking about labels and how controlling they are, how difficult they are about the management of rights, and how they, even in the 90s, in the mid-90s, were beginning to crack down on hip-hop sampling, right? So you use the law. You refuse to clear an album for publication until every sample in a song has been cleared. That's what started to happen. And Nelson George writes about this as well, about the late 90s, right? You didn't have hip-hop that sounded like Public Enemy. Loud, layers of bass, layers of drums, lots of samples, lots of rumbling, noisy, incendiary stuff. You actually had very, very tame, high-pitched synthesizers, G-funk, right? Warren G, all of that kind of stuff, not particularly exciting. So the aesthetic gets watered down, and it coincides with the lyrical and political content of the music also being shut down. So actually, you have two things happening, and this is where I thought I'd be the first to make this connection. But Tricia Rode made this connection in '94. She uses Dick Hebdige's work, Subculture, the Meaning of Style. And one of the chapters is titled Style and Revolt / Revolting Style. So it's about subculture and sort of challenges to hegemony and how political, sort of counter-hegemonic messages are produced through challenging hegemonic understandings of what is aesthetically acceptable. Is that an acceptable way to protest? Is it? No, it's not. Let's do it. Right? That kind of ballpark. And she says there are two ways in which countercultures or subculture, as Hebdige talks about it, are shut down. You use the law, the judiciary. Right? It's piracy. It's copyright violation. Shut it down. But then you also co-opt it commercially. Right? You co-opt it commercially. You do both. That's what happened to hip-hop. That's what happened to the blues. That's what happened to jazz. It definitely happened to reggae. Right? And that's what happened to P2P platforms with Napster. Right? You threaten people with lawsuits, you use the law, a very sort of narrow understanding of IP, right? And then you also attempt to replicate the model. So Napster 2 is by no means Napster 1, for example. It's a very, very different kind of animal, right? The one is peer-to-peer, decentralized. The other one is pay-for-play, right? Subscription, et cetera, and as I'm saying this, I'm reminded that I was the editor of the pay-for-play music website when Napster blew up. The wrong business plan at the wrong time. But I'll tell you about that over drinks afterwards. This is actually how I came to do this PhD. I made this realization that the work I'd done for my master's, that chapter on sampling, why am I not connecting the dots with what's wrong with the business plan of this mission that I'm working on? And why do I get the feeling I'm about to be retrenched because this business will go belly up soon? That story. So two things happen at the same time. And this is the story of hip hop. The problem with it is, as corporates tell you, we're fighting this fight, we're taking you to court for violating copyright because our artists' revenue streams are being cut off. The problem with that argument is, remember Tricia Rose, who owns the back catalogs? Who owns the rights to the music in those back catalogs? Not the artists themselves. And it just happens that that disparity between ownership, between rights holders and creators, that breakdown, happens along racial lines. So if you know the Solomon Linda story with Mbube, or The Lion Sleeps Tonight, Weemowe, it actually was Mbube, Mbube. That's how the song started out. So the appropriation of that song and the fact that various versions of that song made so much money for various artists, including the Lion King movie, whilst the artists or the artists' children made no money from it for a long time until Owen Dean pursued them legally, that tells you something about the contradiction behind the crusade against piracy, that the one is a front for the other, right? Corporate monopolization works in a particular kind of way. I think I've made my point, and I'm 29 minutes in. I made that point. And I've answered this question. What lies behind hip-hop's counter-hegemonic sampling and intertextual practices? It's about speaking back, taking the power back, fight the power, all of that stuff, to which culturally and political history is it responding? I've answered that question, this history of cultural appropriation, this exploitative nature of the industry. But before I move on to scholarly publishing, I do need to reference blackface. If you want to understand cultural appropriation, you also need to understand blackface in emerging theater, music, and later on film during the colonial era. Cultural appropriation wasn't just about, oh, that's nice, I think I'll do that. It extended into this thing called blackface, where artists would literally mimic black people. And they became caricatures of black people. So you would literally blacken up, right? Minstrels, right? And I see Sylvia, I think I saw Sylvia Drainers in the audience. She can tell you a very particular story about minstrels and in this context, right? But in the US context, in the area of slavery, we're really just talking about white people using blackness to project a particular set of ideas about what blackness is in order to construct whiteness. And when black artists felt that they now needed to play this game too, to make money, to access paying audiences, white audiences didn't find them convincing, didn't find them to be authentic. They had a hard time finding paying white audiences. What does that tell you? It tells you that that performance of blackness has absolutely nothing to do with the lived experience of blackness. There's a disconnect. It's a white projection of blackness. That is the background. And so we're talking about unequal relations of power. This kind of explains how it becomes possible for cultural appropriation to become, acceptable, for it not to be recognized as cultural appropriation. If you don't respect people, if you have political and economic power over colonized people, then the work that they produce, the ownership of that work is not respected, right? Because they're not recognized as human or fully human. And now I'm going to just skip to John Locke. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because a particular set of arguments by John Locke became the rationale for the Statute of Anne, which is you might say the one of the most influential pieces of legislation on modern copyright as we know it, right? Influential. Not the first, just influential. And so this is Locke. Locke's logic goes something like this. Every man having rights of property in his body should be justly rewarded for the fruits of his labor. Can you see what's wrong with that? Right? Every man, it's gendered, having rights of property in his body, oh, that would exclude me. In this context, I do not have rights of property in my body. And therefore, I don't deserve to be justly rewarded for the fruits of my labor, and so on and so on. Right? It makes a number of assumptions about why people produce work, whether it's why they produce art, for example, or why they engage in scientific study, that the just reward for labor sort of argument, that's your incentive. The problem with that is colonized, enslaved people produced art, scientific work, all sorts of things, regardless of whether they were justly rewarded. They were not justly rewarded. The other reasons why we produce work, it's not all financial, right? And it's not all individualist. The communal modes of production and knowledge sharing, that is not acknowledged by this. And so the foundational thinking behind IP is individualist, it's racist, it's definitely sexist, and becomes the foundation for how slavery works. If I do not have rights of property in my body, as I build this college, which will later on become UCT, the structure is not mine. I might be an indentured laborer, a slave. What I produce is not mine. And certainly, if I sit down with my guitar and come up with a song, that's not mine either. So whether it's tangible or intangible labor, whatever I produce is not mine. And so that's how you might say, from an IP perspective, this is how it becomes possible for cultural appropriation to become possible from a legal perspective. Black people had no legal recourse. And so there's this funny moment in a documentary about Solomon Linder's song, a documentary by Francois Fustin. And one musician says, you know what, we did, the story is that you're trying to explain how it's possible that Solomon Linder got paid a once-off, maybe, and then there was no royalty agreement, and then the song made millions for a bunch of people, including Pete Seeger and people. He says, you know what, when we asked this A&R rep about a royalty agreement, a contract or something, you know what they told us? Oh, it's not for black people, it's for whites only, this contract thing, right? So there was absolutely no record, no agreement, right, about how profits should be, shared coming out of whatever might be produced. So, that's the Mbube story. And of course we can argue about whether this guy is guilty of this. We can argue about whether Paul Simon should have labeled this album Paul Simon and Friends, Paul Simon and Miscellaneous Black People, something that acknowledges that this isn't just him. It's not the singular auteur, the single genius with his piano and his sheet music writing brilliant work. And then there's this guy. But I don't have time for that because I have 10 minutes. And I don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. I definitely don't have time for that. And certainly not this one. But I do want to point to this history. It's intersectional. Patricia Hill Collins looks at these kinds of representations and thinks about Sarah Bartman in relation to this narrative. I look at 50 Cent and I think about the trope of the field nigger. The house nigger versus the field nigger, both are white projections of blackness. And so it operates in a particular kind of political economy, right? Capitalism isn't just capitalism. Capitalism is also patriarchy at work, racism at work, and so on, right? What does this have to do with us? As scholars, we operate outside of the world, right? We're at UCT, up against a mountain, living in a bubble. We don't live in the real world. Whenever I speak to corporates and they talk to me about the real world, and I say, you know what, in the States, when some random person takes a gun and shoots a professor or students on campus, that is the real world. You really die, So I hate that distinction between what is real and what is not, and the sort of the fiction, the bubble of living on campus. And so the very same questions I might ask about music, I would ask about scholarship. The first question first, before I make the transition, is should we treat cultural expression as a commodity? And the quick answer, and I know a particular musicians association which is working actively against copyright reforms and has a big thing about fair use and characterizes people like Tobias in a less than flattering light. And I'm caught between two camps because I understand the anxiety. The anxiety is this question, should be commodifying cultural expression? Yes, we should. We need to eat. I need to make a living off of this. I need to eat. And this fair use thing is threatening my revenue streams. It's like, my response is, the current IPR regime is not benefiting you anyway. You are being schneid. At any rate, sorry, I just remembered where I was. So, the question then to ask is, that's one question. I would argue that knowledge shouldn't be commodified. But the more interesting question to ask is whose interests are being served. And I would argue the same narrow interests, corporate interests, are being served in the music industry as we see with scholarship. And I'll give you a quick snapshot in the last 7 minutes, according to my clock. First of all, I would argue that IP is a bit of an oxymoron. We talk about intellectual property as if it is property. It's not actually property. If I liked Chaucer's hacked gown, that amended gown, I think that is really good. That's how you rework a PhD gown. If I take it, she doesn't have it. Right? If I like Monet's spectacles, if I take it, that's it, you can't see. But if you tell me something, I go, I like that, I'm going to use it. Even if I kill you to prevent you from using your own idea that you shared with me, that's murder. That's not, I can't stop you from running with your idea. I'm just reproducing what you're doing. It's not theft. So talking about copyright violation as if it's theft is a bit of an oxymoron. It's not true. So the term intellectual property is more like a metaphor. It's an analogy, right? And that allows us to do all sorts of things with ephemeral, with intangible knowledge production. When you write papers, the myth of, we create this myth of scarcity with intangible, with ephemeral production. We treat it as if it is, Monet's spectacles, for example, right? And what I want to just suggest very quickly, that notion of scarcity is integral to our understanding of excellence in a university context. And I'll tell you how very, very quickly. Some very, very clever scholars have argued that actually the term excellence is meaningless. It's a linguistic interchange mechanism. It can be used in all sorts of ways, and it creates this fiction, right? This belief in scarcity. It bundles up scarcity and competition to show that the hyper-competition that arises from performance of excellence is completely at odds with the qualities of good research, right? Anybody can produce good research. It takes the logic of the commons. It takes collaborative work in order to produce solid projects like this book that I want you to buy, right? It took a number of people, right? Buy it. That is far more solid. The logic of the commons produces excellence. What we are being told for the purposes of, first of all, getting a job, a tenured position, making promotion is, especially in the humanities, not so much in the sciences, so no shade on scientists in the room, like yourself. You need to produce the monograph, the sole authored monograph. You need to produce in journals with high impact factors. Your citations need to be yay high. You must use these measures in order to prove that you are being cited by X, Y, and Z. It reproduces scarcity. It's a competitive thing. And it reinserts the singular auteur, the singular genius into the equation. And it monetizes the production of knowledge. And it reduces it to a commodity. That's what it's doing. And I wonder if I have it. So it's no accident that there are 5 holding companies, globally speaking, right? And in 2013, they produced 50% of all papers, scholarly papers. Just 5 holding companies. Guess where those 5 holding companies are located? Guess. No, I'll tell you. In the global north. That's not unlike the fact that, when I started my PhD, there were 6 holding companies that dominated about 70% global market share. When I finished my PhD, I had to go through the entire text to make it 5. When I published my monograph as per, requirements for promotion, I had to go through that entire text and change it to 4 holding companies to dominate 80% global market share. That's for music. For film, for other kinds of media, news and entertainment, I think something like 5 holding companies. Do you see the pattern, right? Let's think about the political economy which you operate. You write a paper, right, for free. You use university resources, you get a salary, right? So it's justified. Where does your salary come from? In the humanities, it's that subsidy. Everything hinges on that subsidy, right? So you're using taxpayers' money to write this paper for a journal which will ask your peers to edit the journal, right, for free. And you as editor will ask your peers to peer review that paper for free. You see where I'm going with this? All of these people get paid a salary. Presumably, most of them, many of them, are at public institutions. So it's taxpayers' money. That's a brilliant scam. I'm not done. It gets better. It gets better. You are in that journal. JWPM, UCT does not subscribe to that journal. So UCT couldn't give me access to that journal that I edited, that double issue. UCT has to pay. UCT can't say, yeah, I just want that one. No, put that down. That one. Yeah, it looks lekker, right? Give it to me. No, you must buy the whole bundle, right? So you buy a bouquet, right? You buy a list, right? So you do it by database. So you have access to a particular set of things, particular databases. It's a package deal, right? And so how do you pay for this? Subsidy. So taxpayers' money. So that's the nature of the scam. You produced the journal, you peer-reviewed, right? So the article, you wrote the article, some people peer-reviewed it, some people edited it. Your university has to pay through their nose to have access to that journal. And the funny thing is, it's not a paper-based economy anymore. The production and distribution cost should be cheaper than a paper journal because you're not printing a journal and posting it or sending it by courier at a certain cost. Why is it more expensive? Ask yourself the same question, the same set of questions about music and streaming and all sorts of other media that operate in this cloud. And of course, I was at a Summer Institute, and one of my fellow keynotes spoke about the metaphor of the cloud. The cloud is a fiction because it's not sitting in the sky somewhere. It's sitting in a physical server somewhere on Earth. And there are cables running all over the world, seabeds. There's hardware that actually stores the content somewhere. It's just not on your computer, right? So it's not in a cloud. That's a myth. So all of this stuff. So the monetizability of everything it's beautiful. It's a fantastic way to make money and create dependence. And that is the terrain in which you operate. Here's the other funny thing. The matrices, the metrics that get used to measure citations and to figure out impact factors, do you think that those entities are public entities? Of course, I'm becoming quite predictable. I think you know the answer. They're not public entities. They're corporate entities. So we, scholars located at public institutions, trust corporations to tell us what our impact factors are, right? And how many citations we're getting. And we use that, please give me a job, I want a permanent gig, or please, can I make professor, right? Linked to that is race and gender. The journals with the highest impact factors, right, are from the canon. So if you're in lit, it's a particular canon, it's a particular set of publishers, particular set of journals. Who are the most cited individuals? Old white men in any given discipline. So it's race and it's gender and it's commercialized. It's a corporate platform. It's not transparent. It's opaque, right? That is the problem with it. So Delgado has done research on the racial politics of citation. I'm going to bore you with it, but basically, long story short, race and gender dynamics are reinforced on a systemic level through citation practices. And that determines who gets jobs, who gets promoted, et cetera, et cetera. It's a particular kind of political economy that is skewed towards a particular set of people. And so obviously the question then is, what do you do about this? And people like Tobias Schoenwetter and Carolyn Fube, Eve J have been working on this. There are other ways of doing this. We need to invest in open access platforms. We need to invest in the scholarly equivalent of P2P and wikis, et cetera, et cetera. We need to produce scholarship that is open and accessible. So instead of spending money on journals and access to all sorts of platforms that are proprietary and expensive, we need to invest time, money, and effort in open source alternatives. And maybe I'm preaching to the converted in this room because I see some people in this room who've worked on Vula, and Vula runs on an engine called Sakai, which is open source. And so UCT is doing a lot of this work to a certain extent. But when it comes to citations and the scholarship game, I think the logic of what CHED is doing needs to be exported to other aspects of scholarly practice, right? It doesn't just matter for scholarship, it also is about reducing the cost of access to knowledge for students. So open education resources becomes an essential part of the story. And so this reminded me of 2015, 16, and 17, that, the good old days, things were so alive with possibility. And I think about calls. What? I mean that. Calls for decolonization. And the punchline, there was a lot of stuff going on. And the thing that really bugged me was, well, how do you decolonize an institution if you don't think about the political economy in which it operates? Right? People have spoken a great deal about the neoliberal institution, and the devil's in the detail. The detail here is the scholarship that we produce and how it circulates, the educational resources that we produce and how it circulates. We can do something about that. We might not be able to go to the Minister of Finance and convince that individual to change our macroeconomic policy, but this public institution can do a particular set of things that tilts things in favor of civil society, in favor of access to knowledge, access to culture, et cetera, away from the neoliberal framework that governs knowledge production and sharing. So I have a lot more to say, but I'm over 5 minutes over time. How do you decolonize knowledge? You decommodify it. But that's not the same thing as saying, say, with Tobias and the musicians who vilify him, and I forget your colleague's name. Yes, Sean. That's not to say that people like Tobias and Sean are begrudging artists their right to make a living. And I think we need to find ways of making people recognize that there are different ways, there are different economies that can actually help us to thrive on an economic level. The thing that interests me more, yes, the economics matter. The thing that matters more to me is if we make access to knowledge exorbitant, what we're doing is we're impoverishing the public sphere, right? For those of you who buy into Habermasian, work on the public sphere, in order for a functional public sphere to operate, you need information to enter the public domain freely. When I say free, I don't free as in free Faluda or Cosistis. I mean freely as in the democratic rights of access, right? You need an information commons. There are two ways in which you can shut down the information commons. You can be China and clamp down on things and become a fascist state, or you can commodify absolutely everything and make access exorbitant. And in a democracy, the commodification of knowledge and of platforms is a very efficient way of shutting down democracy because it doesn't look fascist, it looks like choice, but it is anti-democratic. And so public institutions are, that is the domain where we need to fight this battle. We need to push back on the commodification of knowledge. of the platforms that we use, of the journals that we access, on the publishers that we work with. When you work with publishers, push them on open access. Now we're seeing publishers, various journals playing this game. They're still corporate entities, but they're playing the open access game. They're trying to go for a hybrid. Use that as leverage to push them even further. But I think the university, in terms of its criteria for promotion and appointment, it needs to rethink what it values in terms of scholarly output, in terms of educational resources. If you dealing that from the logic of commodity, the logic of the market, in favor of this thing called the common good, in favor of a functional public, then maybe we can revolutionize this institution. I think. I'm going to close at this point. There's a lot more to say, but I think I've made my point. So basically, a part of the motivation for this particular paper was to sort of say to artists, to scholars, you're not so smart after all. If you're really smart, then you will undo the capture of public institutions. And this is an important point to make in a context where we are going on about state capture. But the scholarly enterprise has always been captured by market forces, right? And we need to undo that. Thank you.
So I get to have the last word, Adam. Vice-Chancellor, Professor Pakeng, esteemed guests, family, friends, colleagues, heads in the room. It's an honor for me to stand here and present this vote of thanks. I'm sure what is an insightful lecture by Professor Haupt. When Professor Haupt asked me to present this lecture, I said, yeah, of course I'll do it. I'm your friend. But then I thought, like Boris Johnson, daunted. Anyway, I said yes because I knew I would speak on behalf of not only myself, but colleagues who are near and far and have developed this field we now call today hip-hop studies. So my thanks not only comes from me, but also all the other hip-hop academics for your contribution to the field, to cultural studies, and for your activism in general inside the academy and outside. In this lecture tonight, we have heard and seen a summary of decades of research and theory development by a scholar and intellectual working not only from the margins of the academy, but on behalf of marginal communities. We are provoked by Professor Haupt to rethink with him tonight some of the key notions, ideas, and practices he has developed in his scholarship over the last decades. He wants us to remix our thinking with regards to what constitutes knowledge, whether it is feasible to pursue open access publishing as scholars, the role of multilingualism and how to sustain that which is necessary for the soul, and of course, how after all, we should proceed with decolonization. I think more than a contribution to hip-hop studies, this lecture has sought to open us up to the cultural theorists in Professor Haupt. His use of the notions sampling, ideology, co-option, countercultures, commodification, piracy, and cultural appropriation are exactly the sort of concepts that has come to define what is essentially South African hip-hop studies. There was none before you. So thank you. Indeed, tonight we have heard explicitly and implicitly what constitutes his theoretical and scientific contributions to such studies. But he also turns our gaze to the importance of decoloniality scholars and what new directions they may offer us on how to tackle the oncoming challenges in the humanities and broadly the South African university. For example, writing recently in our book, Never Again, it's 360 Rand, I think, outside. Shameless. He argues, and I quote, debates about cultural appropriation that see cultures as bounded, fixed, and capable of being owned or stolen instead of viewing them in relation to unequal relations of power run the risk of embedding notions of ownership that are classed, racialized, and gendered. And I'm sure all of you couldn't agree more, since this is also in a way, defines the current zeitgeist of a South African university. If you read his work closely, you'll find that the most developed notion, and he said it many times, is that of sampling. Indeed, he has illustrated tonight what the utility of the notion can be and is. Sampling is a notion that has great utility for the analysis of hip-hop generally, in what hip-hop does, and also in the way that it has transformed popular culture in this country and in the world beyond. If you speak popular culture, you think hip-hop. It's plain as day today. Professor Haupt argues that since the 1980s, sampling practices in hip-hop have provided the means for marginalized people who claim some form of a mainstream voice, allowing them to, and I quote from this book of his, Stealing Empire, to realize that any media representation could be appropriated and recontextualized in order to produce meanings that compete with hegemonic perspectives. His argument here is that the voices of the multitude, our voices, us all, captured in the poetics of the hip-hop artists, are an assemblage of grassroots politics blended with new transmodal technologies. In this lecture tonight, he also introduces us to the very specific contributions he has made to hip-hop studies. Not hip-hop, per se. Can you spit a rhyme? Save your life? Here we see not only the significance of sampling, but also the problems revealed by how the notion can be applied. We are also given insight into his intersectional study of gender, space, technology, and race. Indeed, his approach to race is a very cultural studies approach, where he is very Stewartian about it, looking at race as a floating signifier, difficult to pin down. Indeed, he describes a number of counter-hegemonic strategies that hip-hop artists use daily through sampling and intertextuality, as we have seen. His intersectional approach to gender and race lets us know that Professor Haupt has always been on top of hip-hop's male-dominant game. In particular, the culture's language and marginalization of female and non-binary artists and fans. And here's an early example. One of my favorite early publications of his is entitled Black Thing, Hip-Hop Nationalism, Race and Gender in Prophets of the City and Brasse van die Kaap, or Brothers from the Cape. In this article, Professor Haupt introduces very early in his academic career a conceptual arsenal that would lay the foundations of his theoretical contributions to cultural studies and indeed South African hip-hop studies. He had also there begun a strong rebuke of state repression and nationalism that remains a common thread in his work today, a mainstay of his academic activism. Back then, he was already remixing descriptions of local language use in hip-hop that would define his own lateral approach to multilingualism. His rhetorical moves in this regard greatly influenced my own perspective of remixing multilingualism. And on top of it, he has also brought a socio-cultural lens to the representation of colored identity, blackness, and whiteness at the transition from apartheid into our now turbulent present. Before I had read the aforementioned article, I discovered As a student, Professor Haupt's MS thesis in the library at the University of the Western Cape. This thesis, kept in the closed stacked section and in very condition, made a titanic impact on my own thinking. As I sat there, I read it several times, visibly shocked. And I asked myself, how could somebody, anybody, dare to do a study on hip-hop? Well then, I didn't have a topic for my PhD thesis. So I sat there thinking, I'm going to change my thesis topic. But that would have also pushed me to change my whole disciplinary orientation from applied linguistics to social linguistics. Because I wanted to be like Adam Haupt. I'm in the game, baby. Sorry, I'm going to go off script here a little bit. It's the line from Jay-Z and Lil Wayne performing. The heads will know. Performing Brooklyn, Hello Brooklyn, you know, where Lil Wayne says at the end, the best rapper alive, the next rapper in line. Anyway, it was in the closed stack section, and I nagged the librarian for weeks on end to digitize, because, you know, hip-hop needed it. The streets, well, the academic streets needed it. And I'm glad we did. Hip-hop studies in South Africa would not be what it is today if not for the intellectual efforts of Professor Haupt. Even if you teach about, with, and through hip-hop in your undergraduate and postgraduate studies, you cannot not cite him. I've had in the past the extraordinary pleasure of teaching a course on hip-hop with Professor Haupt, and in this context, or that context, I've seen countless times how he brings to life his cultural studies lens on hip-hop, youth culture, and the socio-politics of our country. Sometimes, when teaching, we would often debate quite strongly issues about language and the importance of hip-hop. You see, I was annoyed because he knew too much of Saussurean linguistics and enough Chomsky and Persian semiotics to frustrate me into silence. But I was always in awe when he waxed lyrically about the dynamics of gender, race, activism, black consciousness, issues of censorship, social inequality, and the pressures of the neoliberal economics for hip-hop artists in South Africa and around the world. Because we could see what is happening to hip-hop artists. We could see how they lived in poverty because of the unfairness of the neoliberal market. I recently said in an interview that one of my greatest pleasures of working on our book, Never Again, sold outside for 360 Rand, was the fact that I, a young sociolinguist, got to work with one of the most creative and hardworking individuals in the academy today. I went further to say that I have worked on other edited volumes before, but that my co-editor, Adam, is the most intellectually inspiring writer I've worked with. I remember sometimes during the write-up of this book, Never Again, we would WhatsApp call each other 3 o'clock in the morning just to get behind a small editorial issue, already having worked the whole day. And after we finished the book, we said, never again. But then we completed a double issue on hip-hop activism and representation shortly thereafter. Yara, never again. Anyway. Fellow audience members, these words merely understate the important contributions of the scholar, what he has done for the science of hip-hop, the recent endeavors in scholarship of hip-hop studies, and cultural studies in this country. But for myself and fellow academics and students, hip-hop heads, turntablists, graffiti writers, breakdancers, MCs, activists, Adam, we thank you for your scholarship, your energy, your intellectual guidance and creativity, and for everything that you've done for this thing that we call hip-hop. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a hand of applause for hip-hop's very own Professor Adam Haupt.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam, for sharing your work with us, your creativity, your energy. It was a very inspiring lecture. It's the first time I see an inaugural lecture where people give someone a standing ovation. Well, but I haven't been here long. Maybe it's been... I'm just saying, in my history. But it still counts. It's my history, right? So, but it was very inspiring. Thank you very much. And Quinton, thank you. I hear that you said never again. But try again. Definitely, definitely. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, actually they were not supposed to say anything about the book being sold outside. That was supposed to be my line. I was supposed to tell you that the book is outside and it's 350 rands. I don't know why they did it themselves. I don't know, and they did it so many times. But please, I request you to please forgive them. They didn't say anything. It is me who said the book is outside, it's 350 rands. And never again. Please buy it, and never again. Thank you very much for joining us for this lecture. Thank you to the DVCs, to the acting dean. There's refreshments outside, and the book is just outside, 360 rands. Thank you. You can rise.
Thank you. Thank you.